Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of my podcast, Grit Stories of Resilience. Today's guest is a longtime friend I have known since the summer of 1980, uh, Rick Gammon. Rick was a law student at Campbell Law School. We hired him as an intern in the United States Attorney's Office that summer. He came and did such a great job, though I must confess, as I told him earlier, I can't remember any of the cases that we worked on that summer. I only remember he was a strong guy. And the afternoon one, I think in July, we were having a social at a clubhouse, and he was carrying the ice, into the clubhouse. He asked me if I would help, and he held his side by one hand. It took both of my hands to carry up my side. He's a good guy. Later on, he was president. It was the Student Bar Association, Rick. Is that what it was at Campbell?
Yes, yes.
He was president of the Student Bar Association. So Rick asked me to come and make a talk to the student body one evening. President Wiggins was there. It was a week before the election. And we were all in the U.S. Attorney's Office on tenterhooks, hoping that Jimmy Carter would somehow pull out a miracle and win. And therefore, we would all keep our jobs. And he did not win. Not only that, Senator Morgan, he didn't win either. So it was not a good day at Flat Rock for us. And that was doubly bad because Rick was going to come join us after he graduated from law school if we had been successful. Failing that, though, he and I went into law practice together in the early fall, I think, of 1981, around October. And we'll talk about that a little bit and how we set up a law practice in a law firm with no filing cabinet, no secretary, a table which we put shoe polish on to make it look a little bit better, and no money and no clients. But we'll talk about how that got started. He rose from that lowly beginning to become one of North Carolina's very best lawyers, particularly in the field of criminal defense. And without telling you how old he is, because if I did that, I'd have to tell you how old I am. He is 10 years younger than me and has been. I don't know why that has never changed, but he has always remained 10 years younger. Rick, good to see you, my friend.
Good morning, Jim.
How you doing today?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Good, good. You remember when we set up a law practice and we were getting ready to move into this little back 2 rooms of Gene Boyce's building on the third floor in the building right behind the Justice Building on Federal Street Mall. You remember that?
I do remember Gene was kind enough to rent the office to us at a very low price because I don't think he thought we were going to make it either.
No. And we, I remember getting a card or note from Judge Dupree congratulating us on setting up our law firm. The name was Blackburn and Gammon, and he kept referring to his backgammon. That was his sense of humor with us. He didn't think we were going to make it. Nobody thought we were going to make it. So
We didn't think we were going to make it.
that's right. I remember we were talking before we came on. I think we had 2 phone lines. Is that what it was?
Yeah, we had two phone lines, and the reason we did is so we could check one of them at a time to make sure they were still working.
And that's what we did for a long time.
And we ate ice cream on the mall several days in a row because we didn't have any, no one called the line.
Somebody finally called, didn't they?
They did. They finally called, and then the phone started ringing thanks to our friends who were referring us business that they didn't want.
That's how we got started. That's how
That's
we
how
got
we got
started.
started.
Well, we had trouble staffing our firm. We were always on the lookout for a really great secretary. And I remember we were talking that it became your job. You were the enforcer of the firm. And it became your job to part ways a couple of times with one of the secretaries. What happened one time you were talking to one lady and what you all met someplace other than our office? What was
Yeah,
that?
that was the first person I ever had to fire. And of course, I hated doing that. And I asked her to meet me at Daryl's on Hillsborough Street for lunch. And when she got there, I had already gotten a pitcher of beer and had one beer. And when she sat down, I said, "By the way, you're fired."
Oh my
It took the beer for me to have the courage to do it.
I, I, there was so many stories like that. Anyway, you were a Raleigh policeman at one point before law school. Is that right?
That's correct. I was a police officer for 3 years in the early 70s, and then decided to go to law school and went to Campbell Law School and started in 1978, finished in 1981.
Why did you become a policeman?
Well, at that point in time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had three brothers who were physicians, and it was assumed, I guess, that I was going to be a physician. And two things about that: one, I didn't want to be, and two, I wasn't smart enough to be one. So I decided to go find a job to see if I could find out what I wanted to do. And by going to the police department, just by chance, I went with the police department. And of course, going to court, seeing what the lawyers did and so forth, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer and returned to go to law school.
Did you enjoy law school? Was that a good experience for you?
Well, law school, I did enjoy it. I do enjoy studying the law. There were certain courses I didn't particularly like. I was not interested in things like workers' comp, family law, and things like that. Because of my days as a police officer, I was interested in criminal law and criminal procedure, but I enjoyed the others. Had some great professors that were visiting from Harvard and William and Lee there at Campbell, and they made the other courses very interesting.
I remember talking to you once before several years ago in an interview, and I think I was asking you what was the funniest thing that ever happened to you as a policeman, and you recounted the story of picking up a lady. I don't remember what she had done wrong, but you and she got into a fight in the car as you were taking her downtown. You remember that?
I remember it. Unfortunately, it's ingrained in my mind. Yeah, I picked her up. She had bitten a clerk at a grocery store. I think it was a Winn-Dixie. And I picked her up and I was going to just give her a citation for assault and have her appear. And when she got outside the door of the grocery store, she ran. So I had to run after her and tackle her and put cuffs on her. And I put her in the back seat of the car. And the back seat of police cars have a shield. Some of them are metal. Mine was plexiglass to prevent the prisoner from getting into the front seat while you were driving to the magistrate's office. And she started kicking the shield. And of course, I was laughing to myself because I've never seen anyone break one of those shields. They're pretty strong. But sure enough, she broke the shield. It shattered in about a million pieces. And the fight was on at that point in time. She grabbed me by the neck, and eventually she ended up biting me. And we had a pretty good fight, like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. And but finally got her subdued and got her to the magistrate's office. But I had to go to the hospital after all that. And of course, I everyone on the police department thought it was real funny that I had gotten my butt kicked by a woman. But she was a pretty strong woman, that's for sure.
During the time that we practiced law, it was not a long time, but during that time, we had at least two cases that were court appointed with people charged of murder. Each of them, I think, with three murders. The first one was Leroy McNeil, who had confessed essentially before the trial. And I remember that the jury was out for several days and came back on a Monday. And I've always told people, don't, when the jury is out over the weekend and they come back on Monday, you're going to lose because they go to church on Sunday and then they hammer you on Monday. And I remember that happened. What was that like for you? That you were long out of law school. What was that like for you to be involved in a case like that?
Well, it was a great experience, but it was incredibly emotional. I mean, I had been out of law school maybe 18 months to 24 months. And here we were in a triple murder case. And, it was emotional. I mean, you pour your soul into one of those cases. And even though the person has done horrible things. Most times the question in a death penalty case is whether the person's going to get life imprisonment or the death penalty. And in this particular case, the jury returned a death verdict. And I distinctly remember Don Stevens was the prosecutor in that case, and Judge Farmer was the judge. And I just remember so well hearing Judge Farmer read the death warrant in that particular case. And if a lawyer's never heard a death warrant being read out loud, basically sentencing someone to death, and how it's phrased, every lawyer should hear that. But it was emotional for me. I remember just when it was all over, just going into the back room and all this emotion, crying, and emotions just came out of me because acknowledging what the client had done was a terrible thing, but um, it was just incredibly traumatic to experience that for the first time in a courtroom.
It never does get easier, does it?
No, it doesn't get easier. I think uh, you once you've heard one death warrant, you sort of know what to expect. I did not know what to expect. And I think being a young lawyer and a young person at that point in time, it had a profound effect on me and how, I practiced law from that point on.
We also tried the case against the then sitting lieutenant governor. I think that was later, 1983, I
It
think, in
was,
the fall. Jimmy Green
yes,
on fraud charges. And the case went, I think the trial went a couple of weeks
it
uh,
did.
with a lot of attention. Was that the first time you were involved in a case like that that had that much public attention attached to it?
Well, that was the first case in North Carolina that was being that was being filmed live. And so there was just a tremendous interest in that case from the news media and the public for that matter. And of course, you were appointed by Governor Hunt to handle the case. And since I worked with you, I got to work on the case. And Howard Twiggs and Wade Smith represented the then Lieutenant Governor. Well, actually, I think maybe he was out of office at that point in time, but I can't remember for sure. But anyway, so you guys were big names, and it was quite an experience for me to get to go along for the ride.
Well, you did more than just go along for the ride, of course. We didn't win that one either.
No,
My favorite story about that, that the line is defeated as an orphan, but victory has 100 children. Well, we were orphans that day when all of our friends deserted us in the courtroom and left us sitting there by ourselves, I think within minutes of the verdict coming back.
yeah.
And we sort of drowned our sorrows later that day over pizza and lots of beer at your place.
We sure did. More beer than pizza.
That's right. Later on, we went our separate ways, and you became a really top-notch criminal defense lawyer in Wake County, particularly at first, I guess, in district court. What kind of cases are in district court?
Well, they're mostly all misdemeanors, DWIs, even speeding tickets, um, and assault cases, minor assault cases, and things like that. Resisting arrest, assault on police officers, and things like that.
What would a typical day have been for you back then?
Well, back then, I was actually, because of my work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, that you were so kind to give me a job. Um, I was familiar with the federal court system, so I was handling federal court at that point in time, and district court and superior court. I mean, that's basically how I started. And my typical Monday morning would be to, if I had federal court, would be to go to federal court, answer calendar call, then go to superior court if I could make it. And of course, I had a great paralegal, Frida, who covered me many, many times. But for district court purposes, I would get a calendar, and some days I would have 30 or 40 cases set on that calendar, some DWIs, some speeding tickets, some cases that I knew was going to be continued. And of course, I couldn't be in all, there were four courtrooms. I couldn't be in all four courtrooms at one time. So Frida would help me answer calendar call, and then I would make my way through the courthouse to determine which clients were there, which were not required to be there, and then start going through systematically trying to handle the cases. And most of the trials occurred later in the morning, so we handled speeding tickets, things that could be resolved by plea, and then the trials were later in the morning or later in the afternoon. We had two sessions. One started at 9 and one started at 2. But it was stressful every morning and at 2 o'clock every afternoon to get everybody where they needed to be and to try to, handle the cases the best you could.
When did you ever see clients?
I saw clients at night. I actually would start after court generally at around 5:30, and I would see clients on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday nights, um, from 5:30 to 7:30 or 8, just depending on how many wanted to see me. I would see clients on Wednesday if I needed to, and also for trial purposes for superior court and federal court, I'd meet with clients on the weekend.
That's a tough life. How many years did you do that?
I did that for full time for 27 years. Um, and then I started backing off of the practice of not trying to do so much and did more superior court work and concentrating more on superior court work and federal work and less district court work. It was just too much, quite frankly. I mean, you and I were talking yesterday. I probably crammed 50 years of practicing law in that 27 years. And of course, I've been practicing now since 1981, and I'm mostly totally retired now, but I backed off significantly after 27 years. I was just burned out, quite frankly.
Did you ever think about becoming a prosecutor, being on the other side as
Well,
a
when
defense
being on
attorney?
the police department, of course, working with you in the U.S. Attorney's Office, you had were willing to give me a job as an assistant, which would have been a prosecutor because I would have worked in the criminal division with Wally Dixon and the others. So yes, I was interested in being a prosecutor. I think that was my first inclination as far as practicing law. I went to the local DA before Colin Willoughby and talked to them about a job after the election, after President Reagan won the election. And you lost your job and I lost my job.
Yeah,
Well, you
we're
lost your job, and
unemployed.
as a result, I lost my job. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And and that DA at that particular time told me not to call him. He called me, which I knew what that meant. And so I just went into private practice, and you and I went into private practice. And, after a while, there was just no turning back. I mean, the practice had blossomed, and for both of us, we were busy very quickly, and fortunately, we didn't have to go back and do anything else at that point in time.
I still remember seeing Judge Earl Britt, federal Judge Earl Britt, one Saturday morning at the Crabtree Valley Mall outside one of the department stores. And he sees me, and we hadn't been in practice but about a couple of months. And he wanted to know if we were making any money. He was worried about us. He says, is there some way I can send you all some help? I said, well, Judge, we'd always love to have your help, but we're making a little bit. I told him what our revenues were for the last month. They weren't bad. They weren't huge, but they weren't bad. He said, well, oh my God, I'm not going to worry about y'all anymore. He just,
Yeah,
go
we
ahead.
were, we were very fortunate, that's for sure. With your uh with your status and abilities and name as an attorney, we started getting business. And of course, I knew from being on the police department, the fellow officers referred me business, and it turned out to be a good situation, that's for sure.
I've always thought of all the times there have been two times in my life, in my legal career, cut short as it was, that I really enjoyed. One was the United States Attorney's Office, and the other was the 2 or 3 years that you and I practiced law together. The rest of it was work.
No,
We,
it's pricing law, if you do it the right way, is incredibly difficult. It is
yeah.
stressful. You can get burned out, as I did. It can affect your personal relationships, your health. And, I tell lawyers, my law partner, Joe Zatarski, who's one of the best lawyers I know, if not the best lawyer I know, I tell him all the time he works very, very hard, just like we did. And I tell him all the time to take care of yourself. You don't want to burn out on this. There's more to life than just practicing law.
How long did it take you to figure that out?
27 years. Actually, it didn't take quite that long because I just decided I couldn't keep that pace up, and I didn't want to keep that pace up. I wanted to stay involved in the practice of law, but I just didn't want to have that type of stress and pressure on me anymore. And I think that's one reason people hate practicing law. And I think that's another reason why professionalism is down in the profession, is because of the stress and pressure that the practice of law puts on lawyers.
Tell me, the case that I asked you about the other day on the phone, I think, is one I want to ask you about here today. And that's the one where you represented a fella who later took his own life, um, and was involved in an unfortunate situation. And you had information about what he had said to you, advice you'd given him, and what he'd said, and the DA wanted it, and you couldn't give it to him, or didn't feel like you could give it to him because of the attorney-client privilege, even though he had passed away. The case that went all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. Tell us about that.
Well, the case ultimately involved a wife who was killing her husband with arsenic, and the wife was having an affair with my client. And the client came to see me. He had not been contacted by the police. The police didn't know anything about the affair. They figured it out, however. And he had given me information about the case. And then when the police started focusing on him, he committed suicide. And so my good friend Colin Willoughby, who was the DA at the time, he decided that he wanted to know what I knew. And of course, I refused to provide any information based upon the attorney-client privilege, which I felt very strongly about. We had a hearing in Superior Court. Don Stevens was the judge. He ordered me to turn over the information. I still declined. And of course, he was kind enough not to throw me in jail, but understood the legal issues. And then it got appealed to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, but the Supreme Court immediately took it because it was going to eventually end up there. And so the Supreme Court heard the case. they sent it back ruling that I had to turn over an affidavit under seal that reflected the conversations that I had had with the client. But they did not order that I had to turn it over other than under seal, so that the Judge Stevens, can make a determination, number one, whether it was relevant and probative, and number two, whether the attorney-client privilege applied. Judge Stevens then reviewed it, decided that yes, it was probative, it was relevant, and the attorney-client privilege did not protect it. He used a balancing test, basically saying the interest of justice and administration of justice outweighed the privilege. That's used in other privileges, for example, physician-patient privileges and things like that. The Supreme Court affirmed the fact that I had to turn the information over to the DA, Mr. Willoughby, but they found that it was not a case where the balancing test was appropriate. They found that in this particular occasion, the attorney-client privilege didn't apply because the client was dead, and although the privilege survives death, that there was no potential criminal liability, there was no potential civil liability, and there was no issue as to reputation or anything like that. So they found that the privilege did not apply, and therefore they ordered me to turn the information over to the district attorney.
That information that was turned over subsequently, at least indirectly, if not directly, led to the indictment of the man's wife who was doing the arsenic poisoning. Isn't that right?
That's correct. It probably was instrumental, and the case ended in a plea. And I think she got 25 to 26 years. I don't remember exactly. She pled to second degree, I think. And I believe it was directly responsible for the defense entering a plea as opposed to going to trial.
How do you feel later on, all these years later? Do you still believe that you were correct in withholding the information due to attorney-client privilege, or do you think the Supreme Court was correct?
I think I was correct, and I still disagree with the opinion. I think the Supreme Court basically knew that they wanted to force me to turn it over, and then they tried to figure out some legal way to make it make sense. But I still totally disagree. If that had been a break-in case or a larceny, a bicycle case, I don't think the court would have ever ordered me to turn over that information. But because of it was a murder case, I think that swayed the court, which I don't think is. It's either the attorney-client privilege applies in a larceny of bicycle case the same it applies in a murder case. But I think the magnitude of the case is what turned the court and forced me to turn over the information. I respected their opinion. I mean, they are the court of North Carolina, the top court. And, I've said often it wasn't up to me to defy any court orders. I didn't have a dog in the fight with regard to the defense of the wife. I wasn't trying to condone what she did. I was just trying to protect the attorney-client privilege.
How did you get from that to representing later on in your career so many cases? I guess they're awful cases. People charged with doing awful things. How did that happen? How did you come to that you would do that?
Well, I think that in order to do criminal defense work and to do it with emotion and determination, I think you have to believe in the Constitution. You have to believe that our system of government in the United States is far better than anywhere else. And it's that way because of the safeguards that are provided for in the Constitution and the interpretation of those safeguards by the U.S. Supreme Court. And it may be idealistic to say that defendants have these rights, but the truth of the matter is we all have these rights. And once you mitigate those rights, or once you compromise those rights in one case, then what's going to stop that from happening in a second case? It may be different when you're reading the paper and you're reading about a murder case, but what if it were your son who was picked up on a drug offense that he didn't commit? You still would want your son to have those safeguards of being found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And one of the main jury arguments I always made was the jury is not asked to make a decision of whether someone is guilty or innocent. We'd probably be there years trying for a jury to decide that. What a jury is asked to do is, do you find beyond a reasonable doubt? Doubt that is evidence that entirely convinces and completely satisfies you of someone's guilt, or do you not so find? So they're either guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, evidence that entirely convinces and completely satisfies, or they're not guilty. Not guilty does not equate to innocence. And that, as I said, was one of the main arguments I would make to a jury. Um, it wasn't I was condoning the activity, it was that I was preserving our system of justice. And I saw myself doing that. And that's not an egotistical statement. Lawyers do that every day, both in criminal and civil cases. And judges do that every day. And that's what we're supposed to do.
Is it tough, even with those views, is it still tough to represent people who have done awful things?
Oh, of course. I mean, you have to be careful. You can make a moral judgment. There's no question about that. I mean, I think we're all human and we make moral judgments, but the jury is the group of individuals that have to decide whether someone's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Not me, not the prosecutor, not the judge. And you know, you may know they're guilty. They may have told you that they're guilty. You can't let them lie on the stand, and you can't do that. But we tried a number of cases where the defendant never got on the stand, and the defendant has a right not to get on the stand. And that's one of our safeguards in our criminal system. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, you sit there and look at the family of the victims in the cases, or even the victim, if it's a sexual abuse case or something like that. And sure, your heart goes out to those people, or it should go out to those people.
What's the looking back on your career since 1981, what is it that you are most proud of in your career that you would want to tell people?
I think for me, and I would hope that most everyone that I dealt with would agree, that I never played games. If I said that something was A, B, or C, it was because I legitimately believed it was ABC. I never tried to misinform anyone. Did I make mistakes? I'm sure I did. But my word, I tried to make sure my word was my bond. And I would hope that other people who dealt with me would feel the same way. And I think that's one of the reasons I served for 9 years on the Disciplinary Hearing Commission. And I think one reason that I was proud to do that was because I felt that was another way that I could help the profession stay strong and stay honest and with integrity, because without the integrity of the profession, the public loses, uh, we lose the public support, and then the public mistrust even more than they do now lawyers, which is, the famous joke about, lawyers are at the bottom of the totem pole as far as credibility is concerned, which I don't believe, quite frankly, and not because I'm a lawyer. It's just that I've dealt with so many that I found to be fair and honest.
You know, looking back, there's another case that you were involved with that became a little, maybe not as high profile as some, but more than others that I recall very well. I was not the lawyer in the case. You were, and you were one of my lawyers back many years ago. You remember that time, I guess.
I do very well.
What was that like? I hate to ask this question because I'm afraid you might tell the truth. And that is, what was it like to represent a friend?
Well, not only a friend, but a mentor as far as, you were concerned. I think the difficult part about doing something with someone like that is that many times you have to tell a client the hard truths about their case. And I think it was difficult, and I think it's difficult in every case to sit down across from you or another friend and say, this isn't going to turn out the way you want it to turn out. And you have to understand that there are these interests, there are these facts that we just can't get around. And I think that was difficult for Wade Smith and myself in your case, is to have to tell you things that we knew that you were not going to want to hear. But there were things that it was reality and you needed to face the reality. Plus, I think Wade and I both felt incredibly sorry for you. And, I think we struggled with how it all happened. And we felt a great deal of sympathy and empathy for you with regard to the mental health issues that you suffered from during that period of time.
I remember, and I should tell people this, I've only had Chateaubriand at the Angus Barn one time in my life. And that is when you took me out there one evening. Uh, I don't remember the month of when. I remember it was the year 1993. I don't remember the when, but there had been a paper story that day, a newspaper story, and that was the day that they had written about my mental health issues, and it all became very public. And you decided you need to take me to dinner. That's where we went. I remember that. My other great memory is uh, having pizza with you at your house within the first week after it began to break. And those types of things are the way, yeah, I know you can't do that with every client. I understand that. But yet that was a way that you were able to bridge the relationship between being an attorney and uh, being a friend. And so I remember I've told lots and lots and lots of people, almost everybody who ever wants to listen, that you and Wade represented me for free at no charge, as I remember that. And so I want to say thank you for that, if I have not done so before, but I do want to say publicly thank you for that. Looking back at everything, what's the end on a sort of a lighter note, not too heavy? What's the most interesting, even a little bit humorous story that you can remember from your time in practicing law?
Oh, there are so many of them, I think. It's kind of hard to narrow it down. I think the one thing about doing criminal defense work, you're always lied to generally. The client comes in, you have the initial conference, the client doesn't have any trust. They're not going to sit down and tell you all these terrible things they have done. So you need to build trust with them in order to properly represent them. And over time, you try to develop that trust so that they will speak with you. But clients are notorious for just lying to you at first. But I represented this guy who was charged with a major drug offense in federal court, and the government wanted him to cooperate. And so I went to the jail. He was in the jail, and I went to see him. And he said, I've never sold cocaine in my life. I've never sold drugs of any kind in my life. So I called the U.S. attorney. I was actually talking to the U.S. attorney. That's how much the government wanted him to cooperate. So the U.S. attorney said, well, Rick, we don't usually do this, but why don't you come over here and we'll give you a dog and pony show of the evidence we have against him. So I went over there, and for an hour, I listened to and saw with videos and undercover agents that he sold a kilo of crack cocaine to an undercover agent. So I went back to the jail and I sat down and I talked to the client and I said, this is kind of really funny and interesting, but I just got back from the U.S. Attorney's Office and I saw a video of you and I heard your voice selling a kilo of crack cocaine to an undercover agent. And with a straight face, he looked at me and he said, "Well, that's the only time I ever did it." And I thought that was hilarious that, he had to admit the one, but he didn't admit the other 100 times he probably did it. But it's stories like that to keep you going sometimes and you laugh about.
How do you decide whether to take a plea or try a case?
Well, the facts dictate that to some degree. I mean, you have to look at the totality of the circumstances with regard to what the witnesses say, who are the witnesses, what's the evidence, and you also have to listen to your client. You may have, the government may have all the evidence in the world that would convict your client in front of a jury, but if the client says they want to go to trial, they go to trial. Now, again, you can't put them up there to lie, knowingly put them up there to lie. But if they want a trial, they get a trial. And but most of the time, clients, they come to you because they think you know what you're doing, and they take your advice. And so it's basically, is there some way or is there some issue with the government proving beyond a reasonable doubt that your client committed the offense?
I don't know if did you ever try any cases with Judge Dupree? I don't remember whether you did or did not.
When I was an intern, I was in the courtroom with several of the cases that Judge Dupree tried, but I never personally tried. I just am pleased in front of Judge Dupree, I believe, but I never tried a case with him.
He used to ask this question when he was picking the jury. And, the federal system, the judge asks the questions, not the lawyers. His last question was always something like this. Is there some question that I have not asked you that you want to tell me about? Is there something that you know that I have not asked you that I should know before deciding whether to pass on you or let the lawyers pass on you as a potential juror? So, with that in mind, I want to ask you here as we close, is there some question that I have not asked you this morning, or some point I have not touched on, or something that you think would be interesting that we haven't covered?
Well, no, not exactly. I think we've done a pretty good job of covering everything.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, I think one of the issues with the stress of the practice is you have to be careful that you don't let that stress destroy your personal life. And that can happen, and it can happen quicker than most people think it can happen. And unhappiness within the legal profession. I talk to lawyers all the time who are miserable, and doing a job every day that makes you miserable can put you in a very bad place as far as depression, mental health issues, substance abuse, and all those things. And to some degree, my advice, as it is to the lawyers I talk to, is that you got to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your clients.
Looking back, what's the most humorous memory that you might have from the practice of law?
Oh, that's pretty easy. You probably will not remember this, but on a Saturday morning, you called Wade and you called me to explain to us. You wanted to talk to us because of the things that had happened to you. You had done these things and you needed lawyers and you wanted to talk to us. And so we met at Wade's office. I'll never forget this. And you, for about an hour, tell Wade and I this story about the things that you had done, the way that you went about doing them. And Wade and I both just sat there in amazement. I mean, I could tell from his reaction and my reaction. We just listened. And quite frankly, neither of us could believe that we thought this was fiction, that this really, you didn't really do these things. And so one of the last things you said when you walked out of the office is you turned around and looked at Wade and me, and you said, "Now I know what you guys are going to do. I'm going to walk out of here and y'all going to start laughing. I know exactly what you're going to do because I know both of you that well." So you walked out the door and we saw you back then. Wade had his office was where you could see the Fayetteville Street Mall. And we saw you walk away, and Wade and I turned to each other, and both of us busted out laughing after we assured you we weren't going to laugh about this. But we weren't laughing because it was funny. We were laughing because of the stress and pressure and the things that we had heard. We just needed that release. But you said, "I know what you guys are going to do. You're going to laugh at me." And, I don't do that. And we, of course, told you we would never do that. And as soon as you walked out, we did it.
I understand that. I remember saying those very words
Yep.
to you all.
Yep. And then, like I said, it wasn't funny. We just needed a release of all that emotion that had built up in that room from you telling us your story.
And the last story I want to tell and was I remember the first night I'm at the Wake County Jail, and they put you in an orange jumpsuit, you know. It's not very pretty with black socks and all this stuff. And I remember uh, you were saying to me one time during the preceding months, Jim, I can't believe that you will ever go to jail. And I remember saying to nobody in particular, well, Rick, we were wrong on that one. And then John Baker was still the sheriff, which was a good thing for me because I knew John Baker and he put me in a nicer place than I otherwise might have been. So I was in a room by myself. And just as I was walking to the room, the loudspeaker comes on that I had a visitor. And I could not hardly believe that I had a visitor. So I go out, and you're on the other side, with the phones and the plexiglass and all that kind of stuff. And you say to me, Blackburn, if people could only see you right now, they would just be amazed. And I remember saying back to you, what's the matter? You don't like orange?
Yeah, I remember that as well. Yeah, I was worried
Anyway,
about you. That was the first night you were in custody, and that obviously is a traumatic event for anyone, but with someone with your background, it had to have been incredibly traumatic.
listen, thank you so much for doing this today. This has been enjoyable. We could have just done this and just told funny stories. We have enough to take up the whole time, but thank you for all that you said today. I think people will really enjoy this very much.
Absolutely. It's good to talk with you.
Thanks. Take care and welcome back next week for another edition of my podcast, Grit Stories of Resilience. Meanwhile, Rick, have a great